Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. I'm going to talk about 4 books which I have recently read. I'm not quite sure how this is going to go because I have not really come to any stable conclusions about these books. It will not be a review, but one in a sequence of videos I have made occasionally under the heading of recent reads. Sort of a charting of my progress as a reader since I've been on BookTube. So before I go into those 4 books, I would like to talk about something that I just read recently at Substack. It is Diary, Jamaica Kincaid, A Letter to Robinson Crusoe. So it's by Jamaica Kincaid. And she was invited to write an introduction to a special 300-year anniversary edition of Daniel Defoe's novel, Robinson Crusoe. And I will read to you the opening salvo. It's quite a delightful piece, and I will put a link to it in the description box below. Dear Mr. Crusoe, please stay home. There's no need for this ruse of going on a trading journey in which, more often than not, the goods you are trading are people like me, Friday. There's no need at all to leave your nice bed and your nice wife and your nice children. Everything with you is always nice, except you yourself are not. And hop on a ship that is going to be wrecked in a storm at night, storms like the dark, and everyone, not the cat, not the dog, gets lost at sea, except lucky and not nice at all you. And you are near an island that you see in the first light of day, and then your life, your real life, begins. That life in Europe was nice, just nice. This life you first see at the crack of dawn is the beginning of your new birth, your new beginning, the way in which you will come to know yourself, not the conniving, delusional thief that you really are, but who you believe you really are, a virtuous man who can survive all alone in the world of a little God-forsaken island. It builds from there. It is a very well modulated critique of colonialism, and I highly recommend the article. I enjoyed it so much that I decided to pull down a book which I have on my shelf by Jamaica Kincaid. I first heard about this at the channel of The Sluggish Reader, but I no longer recall what he had to say about the book. I don't have a lot to say. It's a very slim book, clocking in at about 80 pages. But I will read you some little parts which I enjoyed. I have to say that what surprised me about this was published 35 years ago, was how exactly the tack that Kincaid takes in this is identical to that of her introduction to Robinson Crusoe. So it starts as a letter to the white tourist. If you go to Antigua as a tourist, this is what you will see. Now, Antigua is a small island. I think she says it's something like 12 miles by 9 miles in the Caribbean. I would have thought that the pronunciation was Antigua, but apparently it's Antigua. So take Wikipedia's word for it, or was it Merriam-Webster's word? Regardless, I understand it is supposed to be Antigua, although my natural inclination would be to say Antigua. So it takes the form of a letter to the white tourist, and let me read you a little part from that. Have you ever wondered to yourself why it is that all people like me seem to have learned from you is how to imprison and murder each other, how to govern badly, and how to take the wealth of our country and place it in Swiss bank accounts? Have you ever wondered why it is that all we seem to have learned from you is how to corrupt our societies and how to be tyrants? You will have to accept that this is mostly your fault. Let me just show you how you looked to us. You came, you took things that were not yours, and you did not even, for appearance's sake, ask first. You could have said, "May I have this, please?" And even though it would have been clear to everybody that a yes or a no from us would have been of no consequence, you might have looked so much better. Believe me, it would have gone a long way. I would have had to admit that at least you were polite. You murdered people, you imprisoned people, you robbed people, you opened your own banks, and you put our money in them. The accounts were in your name, the banks were in your name. There must have been some good people among you, but they stayed home. And that is the point. That is why they are good. They stayed home. So I think you see the parallel with the letter to Robinson Crusoe. So the book is not divided into parts, say, numerically, but it definitely has subdivisions. The first part is emphasizing the letter to the tourist, talking about ultimately how ugly the tourist is, you, the tourist, if you will. And then subsequently, the book, while still addressing the tourist, goes into more of a generalized description of the island. So, in Antigua, cricket is a sport, and cricket is culture. But let me just tell you something about ministers of culture. In places where there is a minister of culture, it means there is no culture. For have you ever heard of any culture springing up under the umbrella of a minister of culture? So she paints a pretty bleak picture of life in Antigua. I will read a little bit more. I have done my share of time as a tourist, as this bookmark should denote. Never having gone to Antigua or a similar location, unless Hawaii might be considered such, being an island. But I am close enough to her target audience, I think, to understand her jibes. In a small place, meaning Antigua, in a small place, people cultivate small events. The small event is isolated, blown up, turned over and over, and then absorbed into the everyday, so that at any moment it can and will roll off of the inhabitants of the small place's tongues. For the people in a small place, every event is a domestic event. The people in a small place cannot see themselves in a larger picture. They cannot see that they might be part of a chain of something, anything. The people in a small place see the event in the distance heading directly towards them, and they say, "I see the thing and it is heading towards me." The people in a small place then experience the event as if it were sitting on top of their heads, their shoulders, and it weighs them down, this enormous burden that is the event, so that they cannot breathe properly and they cannot think properly, and they say, this thing that was only coming towards me is now on top of me, and they live like that until eventually they absorb the event and it becomes a part of them, a part of who and what they really are, and they are complete in that way until another event comes along and the process begins again. So that, I think, provides a very good feel for the book. Kincaid adopts the posture of something of a naif. And so, well, anecdotally, I'm recalling when I met some guy that told me he had been hiking around the Indiana dunes, and he went a little far afield, and all of a sudden he was surrounded by all kinds of security forces, and he had apparently gotten too close. He had strayed too close to the Daly compound. Now, the Daly family held a couple of mayorships in Chicago, and this fellow said to me, they have this huge compound, and how did they earn that compound? They did not make it from the salary of being mayor. So this notion of corruption, I believe Chicago has just been called the most corrupt city in the United States. Kincaid presents as sort of something that nobody ever expected would occur anyplace. So whereas we in Chicago are jaded and we expect corruption and grift as part of the normal course of business, she postures herself as somebody more pure and innocent, and sort of feigns shock at the thing. So the book is worth reading. You can read it pretty quick. I think that the introduction to Robinson Crusoe probably says everything she says in the book more succinctly and packs a bigger wallop. But what she said about being in a small place contrasts with something that I just finished up in Mahmoud Darwish's book. This book almost, well, it describes a more complex society and a more complex situation. She talks about a small place being a place where nothing happens aside from Columbus having discovered the place in 1493, but the war hasn't come there. Well, Beirut, 1982, is a place to which the war has come, so it's a complex society, and people are living under some incredibly complicated circumstances. One aspect of this book could almost be considered as a love letter to Beirut. Now, I don't know the politics of the Palestinians or their situation. I don't know what was happening in 1982. I'm coming to this blind, but I understand that Palestinians were and have been refugees, and people were sort of like some people in Chicago. We have a refugee crisis of our own going on, and it's coming, well, I was going to say coming to a head, but it's that's not the right term. It's exploding, and it's about to surpass the ability of the people who are volunteering to deal with it, and we need a either federal response or a state-driven response to the crisis. It has not come. This could be seen as, among other things, a bit of a love letter to the city of Beirut. So let me just read you what he writes about Beirut in this one part. Every visitor to Beirut finds his own special city, and we don't know, no one does, to what extent all these cities make up the city of Beirut, over which weepers are not weeping, because it is over their memories and private interests they are weeping. Perhaps in this manner, the manner in which Arabs came searching for something missing in their own countries, this meeting place of contraries was turned into an obscure naming, or a lung which a mixture of people, killers and victims among them, could use to breathe. This is what made of Beirut a song celebrating the singular and distinctive, where not many lovers asked whether they were really living in Beirut or in their dreams. As for Beirut, no one knows her, and no one is searching for her. And perhaps she's not there at all. It was only in war that everyone realized they didn't know her. And Beirut herself realized that she wasn't one city, one homeland, or the meeting point of neighboring countries, that the distance between one window and another facing it could be greater than that between us and Washington, and that internecine fighting between one street and another parallel to it could be more intense than that between a Zionist and an Arab nationalist. Only in war did the fighters realize that the peace of Beirut with Beirut was impossible. And only in truce did fighters and observers realize this war was endless, and that victory outside the balance of defeat was impossible. Perhaps everyone realized there was no Beirut in Beirut, for this lady sitting on a stone is like a sunflower that follows what doesn't belong to her, dragging lovers and enemies alike around a cycle of false appearances, sometimes with or against them, and other times not with or against them. It is the form for a form that hasn't yet formed, because war within it, I mean around it, is now won, now lost, because in it the constant is the variable and the permanent, the transitory. That's a much more complicated picture than what Kincaid paints of Antigua. It is also much harder to understand. I would like to read a little bit from the introduction here, which I think pries open a little bit the nature of the book better. Well, let me see. There was a part which I don't seem to have bookmarked. I'll read what Darwish is doing in this book to start with. Seeing the invasion, and this introduction is by Ibrahim Muhawi, who also did the translation. Seeing the invasion and the siege, which meant the departure of the Palestinian idea from Beirut as a final attempt to ensure a collective amnesia about Palestine, the poet chose to join battle against oblivion. This choice recalls Holderlin's line, Was bleibet aber, stiften die Dichter, but that which remains is established by the poets. It is no surprise that Darwish, as an artist, should translate the Palestinian experience of war and siege into universal terms, that he should link history and art. For, as the Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo explains, the work of art in opening a historical horizon is an enactment, a setting into work of the truth. There is no truth without history. So I believe that the joining of the battle against oblivion, which Muhawi imputes to Darwish, is dead on. I believe that is a function of poetry. It is what poets do. Muhawi writes, when I asked him whether he thought the text was poetry or prose, Darwish replied that the poet is always a poet. He remains true to himself, whatever he does, in life or letters. He pays attention to rhythm and other verse values in all his writings. Therefore, he, Darwish, does not distinguish aesthetically between poetry and prose, and takes equal care in the form and content of all his writings. So, although the work belongs more properly to poetry than to prose, because it was written by a poet, we can say, since its form is prose, that it partakes of the nature of both. With the exception of the segment on literary criticism, it is a collection of prose poems. Darwish himself gives us a clue to this effect in his description of Beirut as, quote, a musical name which can flow smoothly into a verse or a prose poem, unquote, and in his reference to his friend, the older poet, who was the first writer to write the prose poem in Arabic. So, as a consequence of this mixed form almost, if you will, that is a prose which functions very much like poetry, the meaning is never so clear as the simplistic prose you find in Kincaid. It's often chaotic and confusing. Now, the part about literary criticism I really liked. When I came upon it, it felt like, wow, he's talking to me, because I think I recently posted a video about my love for literary criticism, and it seems as though Darwish was on pretty much the same page. I will link my video in the description box also. So let me see. I read a little bit of this as a short, and I will give the fuller context. Now it comes from an editorial that Darwish published in the newspaper, and it's interesting that amidst all of this turmoil, that he was still thinking about literary matters. If we can't be kind to traditionalism, we nevertheless are not content to accept the chaos of settling into an experimentalism with nothing to say beyond declaring its modernity. And if we complain of the general inability to perfect a language of the people in creative expression, that should not prevent us from insisting on speaking for them until the moment arrives when literature can celebrate its great wedding, when the private voice and the public voice become one. Yes, there is a role for literature, and severing the relationship between the text and those for whom it is transformed into power is the very alienation of letters which the prophets of the final defeat of everything are now extolling. And now comes the part which is speaking to me. At this juncture, we cry out for help from criticism. We call upon it to regain its faith in its power and usefulness. We call upon it to enter the lists now open for spoils. We call upon it to set down norms, the absence of which has opened the field for the ignorant and the counter-revolutionary to foist themselves off as moderns. We call upon it, for example, to reconsider the modern movement in Arabic poetry, which has found room for all sorts of wars, but has now reached a crossroads leading to the loss of the illusion of its unity. And we call upon it to reject the sanctity claimed by a poetic text that allows no tool for its analysis except self-reference and, at the same time, reserves the exclusive right to load itself with all the ideology exterior to this claim that it can manage to disguise. Meanwhile, critic and reader are denied the right to reveal this. Let us then question the dictatorship of the text. Timidity or ignorance have taken us to the point where progress has become afraid to declare itself. Worse, flawless Arabic is now considered a form of backwardness, and correct meter reactionary. Clarity has become a fault, and having a message and communicating it a barbarism. In short, reaction, equipped with all the tools of modern form, has been able to stand to the left of anything laden with a significance derived from tradition. I will leave it there. I was trying to decide, should I go further? I recommend this to you. For a moment, it felt like I was listening to a Steve Donoghue rant on one of his Poetry Thursday videos. I forget how he phrased it one day. The poem that he read lacked any sort of integumentary tissue, such as we come to expect from a poem to sort of contextualize what was going on in the poem. I believe he was addressing the poetry of T.S. Eliot. Incidentally, I believe T.S. Eliot was a reference point for Mahmoud Darwish, and in fact, Eliot's influence in the Arab world, or in the world of Arabic poetry, has been very strong. I will link an article to that effect in the description box if I remember, but we'll see how that goes. It brought to mind, there's for probably about 15 pages in this book, and it's about 180 pages, I think. 15 pages of that are taken up with Darwish quoting other materials, and I'm not really sure where some of these come from, but it put the idea into my head that as a language, Arabic must be so beautiful and so entrancing that when you come under its sway as a native speaker, you are mesmerized before it. And I would like to read just a little snippet from a piece that goes on for about 3.5 pages, which he quoted, which is by somebody named Ibn Athir, A-T-H-I-R, a complete history. Then God, having created the pen and commanded it, so that it wrote into being everything that will exist till the day of judgment, created delicate clouds, the mist which the prophet, God bless and grant him salvation, mentioned when asked by Abu Ruzayn al-Uqayli, where was the Lord before he created creation? And he answered, in a fine mist, with air above him and air below. Then he created the throne on the water. It goes on like that, and I refer you to this as I say, you read the 3.5 pages and you think, what absurd nonsense is all of this? I believe that the translation of Arabic into English probably leaves much to be desired. And so if you undertake this book, be forewarned that you will be sort of doing the breaststroke on a sea of nebulous ideas, and it's very hard to touch ground on any of them and understand exactly where Darwish is coming from. Now that said, I also recently read his book, Mural, which contains 2 poems in translation. The first, Mural, which is considered a masterpiece, although I believe the introduction calls this a masterpiece also. But the second one, which insofar as I can judge from translation, is just as good. And I enjoyed these very much, and all of that sort of wayward meandering, and even the sort of vocal tics, if you will, the repetitions, the morphing from metaphor into reality, and so forth, for me worked much more in this book than in the prose book, because it's poetry and you come to expect that. Now, as I have said somewhere else, I think if I were to reread this, I might become more familiar with Darwish's idiom, if you will, and get more out of the text. I have no plans to do that, but I expect I will revisit his editorial in which he talks about literary criticism. That is right up my alley. So, so far I have talked about 3 of the books, and all that remains is to talk about the Silk Roads, and I will be brief about this. Frankopan uses the term Silk Roads strictly as a metaphor, and he does not, granted, the phrase has always been a metaphor, but I believe it was invented in Germany by some scholar, and it has kind of stuck, and generally people have meant something a little bit more specific when they say the Silk Roads. For Frankopan, it can mean anything. It can mean a series of Dutch islands. That's their Silk Road. That said, I disliked the beginning of the book, and the end of the book, say from 1960s on, well, number one, I felt an aversion to it because I came of age and came of consciousness around the presidencies of Gerald Ford and then Jimmy Carter. And so I have an aversion to seeing times that I lived through treated as history. To me, they are still current events. But that said, I believe that everything he gives you in that aspect of the book is just a summary of headlines, summary of the common knowledge, not disdaining to make reference to Monica Lewinsky, the intern whom President Clinton famously had an affair with. I believe she's mentioned on a couple of pages, he brings in other popular celebrities such as Jennifer Lopez. So I think 50 years from now, if you were to read a history of the Silk Roads, say by a Chinese author, you would probably get something totally different to this, and this probably would be fairly unreadable. It is very definitely from the American viewpoint. Everything subsequent to, say, the 1960s, or even before that, is strictly U.S. based. But that said, everything from the age of exploration, meaning, let us just say 1492 through the 1960s, was a magnificent historical summary. For me, at least, it all covered ground that I know very little about, and I learned an awful lot. So, for me, it's been a very good read. Particularly, he talks about the transition from British petroleum in Iran and how the U.S. managed to step in. All of the events which were happening when I was a child, say when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, people of my generation all had to register for the draft with much fearfulness. Now I understand a lot better the historical context for all of that. That said, this is not a book I would recommend to, well, pretty much to anybody. If you're looking for something about the Silk Roads, I think you have better options. And if you're looking for a new history of the world, which I believe it is, I would bet there are better options as well. I don't think he was totally unsuccessful in trying to tilt the focus or tilt the balance of his attention over to the East. He did some of that, but particularly at the end, he gave no hint of other perspectives on things than, as I say, that available to the typical American newspaper reader. That said, I have a couple of other books. If I can find them. Sigh. You pull these things out and then you don't know what happened to them. I had on my list, what I do is I find books that look interesting and I put them into my saved for later compartment at Amazon. And indeed, there was a book which I had quite a while back put into my cart about the Silk Roads. And by reputation, at least, this is going to be a much better book by Christopher Beckwith, Empires of the Silk Road, which I think is what I was actually hoping more for. I sort of picked up Frankopan on a whim, and as I say, I don't regret reading Frankopan. I regret it only in that it's going to make me postpone possibly reading this, but I wouldn't have picked this up except for actually having made the hard slog through Frankopan. And so I will keep this in mind, and who knows, it is not so bad, just about 400 pages. Well, little more than 350 pages. I expect it to be a much denser text. Now, Christopher Beckwith also has a book, I think it's titled The Greek Buddha, which is also a book which interests me very much. Years ago, at least 20, probably more than that, I was in Hong Kong in a antique shop, and I saw a statue, probably, well, I guess I can't show you on this, probably less than a meter tall, probably more like 2 feet tall. Marble or whatever statues are carved out of the Buddha, but it had a distinct Greek appearance to it, and I had never seen anything at all like that. And I don't remember, there was no proprietor around. I imagine it was probably selling for something like $3,000. And I was just so intrigued by this statue. I would have considered buying it, but number one, the price. That would not have been the end all for me if it hadn't had 2 other strikes against it. I figured, well, it's made out of marble or whatever, and probably I'm going to break it. So that was, I couldn't even see how I would transport it home, you know, even if I finagled the money from somewhere. But ultimately, the third strike against it, which was the major strike, was, while it was a finely sculpted statue or statuette, if you will, it wasn't beautiful to my eyes. It didn't strike me as particularly beautiful. It was well executed. I mean, there was no flaws to the piece. It was just not my style. But because of that experience, that statue has stayed in the back of my mind for decades now. And finally, through Frankopan, I understand a little bit, not perhaps pertaining to the provenance of that particular statue, which indeed may have even been a high-level forgery, one never knows, but at least understanding the background to the Greek Buddha. And I believe his other book will go into that, and I expect this will too. But that early on in the history of Buddhism, before Buddhists became the makers of graven images, if you will, it was, like so many other religions, an imageless religion, and it came into contact with the religion of the Greek Apollo. And in the competitive environment, and this is Frankopan's framing, in the competitive environment, the Buddhists learned to make their images as well. And of course, nowadays, the Buddha reigns supreme when it comes to images. I imagine there is not a more sculpted, more portrayed visage than the Buddha. So I really have my curiosity piqued for wanting to delve into this bit of history, but as yet I'm not going to make a commitment on this. Just a couple of more superfluous thoughts. Because of the apparent genocide occurring in Gaza, I had ordered 3 books by Mahmoud Darwish. I have a book haul video about that. I got the 3 books, 2 of which I just showed you, and this is the 3rd, State of Siege. I was under the impression it was a collection of poetry. It appears to be just one poem which has been broken up so as to create a book-length piece about it. And having finished 2 books by Darwish. I've decided I'm going to put this on hold and not read it anytime soon. And when I say that, I may wait a month. The news about Gaza and the deaths of Palestinians is ubiquitous, and I am not immune to feeling like responding to that. I have no history in any of the politics, and I decided it was high time that I remedy that, and so I ordered the books by Darwish, 2 of which I have read. I probably need something a little bit more historical than impressionistic as poetry is. I believe Darwish was the right choice for me, at least this far. I believe he was a genuine poetic voice, and as such, his preoccupation with the truth and with not forgetting is probably the right thing to appeal to me, formerly a writer of poetry. But if anybody has any sense of a good short history of Palestine, I would appreciate if you would put a comment about that. I'm not saying for sure that I would read it, but I would like to have some other reference at this point than just Darwish. So I will leave this here. We are in the BookTube community into nonfiction November, and for that I am going to be reading, hopefully, some books by E.D. Mural, also touching upon things that Frankopan recently touched upon. The war being the first nail in the coffin of British colonialism, as Frankopan recounts it. So I look forward to seeing what E.D. Mural has to say, and then he talks about the war specifically, but I am also trying to read this, Entangled Life, and for me, nonfiction November may go further than November. It may likely encompass December as well. This book, I believe, is being possibly considered by Fred of Read by Fred. I will put a link to his channel also, possibly even the video in which he mentions it, if I can find that. So, thank you very much for stopping by my channel.